Will NATO expansion provoke nuclear escalation? How does NATO expansion affect European security architecture and the balance of power in Europe? Find out this and more in NATO and the Nordic. The last two Nordic holdouts have begun domestic political discussions about joining NATO. Anyways, these last two holdouts, for whichever reason or other, have thus far abstained from joining the NATO alliance, and are now starting to reconsider their decision. This will result in them applying to join NATO, and the pair of them will probably be admitted into the alliance structure by the end of the summer. And from there, we will see token NATO forces from various major NATO members in theater by the end of October, mostly in Finland. So why isn't Sweden in NATO? Well, if you go back about 500 years or so, Sweden was an historical empire on par with the French, Russians, and Brits. They were insulated from European affairs, so could consolidate power within Scandinavia and then project it south. But as technology evolved, the Swedes found themselves in an increasingly overextended position, and gradually as time went on, they were pushed further and further back until they were pushed back into what is today Sweden's borders. Anyways, since then the Swedes have been apprehensive about using military force and have avoided venturing out beyond their borders in any meaningful way militarily. They didn't take part in the scramble for Africa, they didn't pick either side during the world wars, and they didn't join the NATO alliance. Anyways, the Swedes view this as working out quite well for them, and so historically have had a high public support for neutrality. Both the Swedish left and right really didn't want to join NATO, as they hoped to stay out of any Third World War, despite them being a democratic capitalist nation. Because of Sweden's neutrality, they can never rely on allies, so are extraordinarily militarily competent for their weight class. Finland only gained its independence in the early 1900s, and promptly had a series of territorial disputes with the Soviet Union that we call the Winter War. They fought the Russians to a bloody standstill, but when the snow melted they had to give Stalin what he wanted and more. However, the Finns got to keep their independence, and for the most part their autonomy. We call this process Finlandization. Basically, the Finns got to decide whatever they wanted about internal policy, whether it be economic or political, but the Russians retained the right to veto any security decisions. So despite wanting to join the alliance in the early days of NATO's existence, it never could. Well, come the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Finns felt like neutrality was working out quite well for them, so never felt the need to join NATO. It was the end of history and all. If Sweden wants to have any kind of say in European security architecture, it needs to join. With the restart of history and a new NATO dominance of Europe that didn't exist during the Cold War, it could very easily become the odd man out unless it joins. Any security policy that matters is going to be made within the confines of the NATO framework, and unless Sweden wants to be iced out, it needs to join. A Russian invasion of Sweden is highly unlikely, but that's not why it's joining. It's joining to secure a seat at the table. Finland, on the other hand, is in the direct line of fire if Russia can successfully swallow up Ukraine. Even though Finland massively punches above its weight class isn't that high to begin with, so Russia would ultimately prevail. The odds of them choosing to join are very high, and the odds of them being let in is damn near to 100% as you can be these days. The unified mood of NATO is very anti-Russian, and both of these states will probably be formally admitted into the alliance structure by the end of August. And you'll have token NATO forces in theater by the time the snow falls in that part of the world. The only way that I see this not going through is with credible threat of Russian escalation. Nuclear escalation. And I wouldn't put it past the Russians either. The Russians really don't have the capacity to invade. All of its forces are currently committed to Ukraine, and what's left isn't in any position to invade. Without mass mobilization, Russia is currently incapable of any other offensive operations. With Sweden and Finland joining NATO, you'll see the end of these two countries' historic commitment to neutrality. The effects of this will be felt further down the line. Sweden was an historical go-to country to do negotiations in. By joining NATO, they are giving up the status. However, they are now a participant in European security architecture. The importance of this cannot be understated. Sweden has been silent on European powers for the past 150 years. Not even the Nazis awakened the Swedes. Good job, Putin. Finland is also joining the West, fully, at last. Giving up its final bit of neutrality in order to feel safe, and for good reason. Putin did not invade Ukraine for just Ukraine. But that's a video for another time. This shifts the balance of power so far against Russia it's hard to understate things. Sweden and Finland were two of the most militarized countries in Europe, and the admission of two countries with real militaries is hard to understate. This greatly complicates the Russian strategic position. The Baltic Sea was now essentially a NATO lake. NATO will have troops less than 200 kilometers from St. Petersburg. This will also increase the Russian border with NATO by more than 1,300 kilometers. This massively increases the pressure on the Russian northern flank, without massively changing NATO force structure. This also gives NATO intelligence assets an easier time in spying on the Russians. The admittance of these two countries into NATO is really, really bad for the Russian strategic position. If NATO started putting substantial troops in Finland, it would give Russia a heart attack. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the Swedes are back on the scene. Like I had said earlier, the Swedes have been silent on geopolitical matters for the past 150 years, and we don't know what the long-term ramifications of the Swedes being back are. I don't even think the Swedes know. The Swedes are really a wild card in this regard. They have no experience acting on the geopolitical stage, and it's hard to know what their interests are and how they're going to go about pursuing them. Now this invites a Russian response of some sort. The Russians currently don't have the capacity to engage in a two-front war, and almost all of their forces are committed to Ukraine, and the ones that are left aren't exactly offensively capable. Simply put, invasion is not possible at the moment, unless the goal is to simply forestall NATO joining by Finland. This completely messes up the Russian strategic picture. The Russian military is not prepared to have NATO forces so close to St. Petersburg and the naval base of Polyarny. I sincerely fear like this could provoke an unpredictable response from Putin that could escalate very, very quickly. This has been a presentation by Dime Time Geopolitics. If you know anybody in Sweden or Finland, send them this video. I'd like to know what they think. And remember, only you can like and subscribe.